We all have gaming backlogs. That list of games you're interested in playing, but due to a lack of time, a busy release schedule, or simply not having the system that the game was originally released for, you've not been able to. These could be massive blockbusters that dominate the conversation and have a lasting impact on the way that games are developed, or it could be a smaller independent title that through word of mouth and strong community sentiment becomes a cult classic. The reason for having a backlog are numerous, but when it comes to actually tackling that mountain of games, the road can be treacherous. Due to the ever-forward march of the games industry, there are new games every week and more to add to your stack, meaning by the time you've actually played through one 50-hour epic, 3 more may have taken its place. I wanted to find a way to tackle that, a way to pick up a game that I haven't played and really immerse myself in its world. I wanted to discover it for myself for the first time, but also look over the years of coverage and discussion on the game and understand the true impact of its release. For this first episode, I wanted to do something out of my wheelhouse, a game that, foolishly, I didn't try at the time due to my preconceived notions about what games like this would be like. However, had I known the sheer reverence that would follow the game since then, perhaps I wouldn't have made that mistake. But to truly get to the bottom of what makes this game so revered, I thought I'd start by talking to 2 of the people that have been encouraging me to play it. So Danny, Harry, for this first episode, I thought I would pick a game that you 2 have both talked about a lot in a genre that I'm not typically known for or a fan of particularly, but this has been spoken of so highly by not only you 2, but a lot of other people that I thought it was finally time to play Return of the Obra Dinn.
Yes!
So
Let's go!
Captain! Open the door! Kick it in. Ah! Lest we break it down and take more than those shells!
You bastards may take exactly what I give you!
I thought you were going to say a Pope game. I thought you were going to say Papers, Please, maybe, but I'm excited for Return of the Obra Dinn. I don't know. Danny's completed it. I've not completed this game, but
Yeah,
I've got very close to the end.
I played it on launch. I was straight in there. You will hate it, Jordan, because it's got like no graphics.
Let's take Mundawn, right? Mundawn is a game that you didn't like very much, mainly because of how it kind of controlled. You didn't like the visuals, which was the pencil drawn thing. This has also got the kind of gimmicky, purposefully like lower graphic thing, but it's very smooth, and it looks so much cooler because it's all frozen time. So you're navigating these frozen moments where like there are these pixely kind of bullets flying around, and you can kind of walk around and experience this 3D space looking like a weird like kind of like Game Boy thing, but in full 4K, and it's just a great graphical experience. I think you'll like it, and the actual gameplay of doing the work, getting the detective thing, figuring out little puzzles.
It's very clever in its delivery in that it's super, super difficult because there's varying levels of things that you have to figure out because you're on this boat and you're trying to figure out what happened to everybody. And some are super, super solid because people will just be dressed the same. They will look the same depending on who they were in the crew and what they were doing on the ship. But it kind of gives you this nice sense of progress because every 3 disappearances or deaths that you solve, it goes, right, you've got 3, and then it ticks them off in this book. And it doesn't matter which order you do it in, you just get this nice sort of, oh, that's 3 more in the book. I've made some progress, instead of having to try and solve the whole thing in one go. So it's a nice little pit stop because it can be really difficult in some points.
Has a great sense of kind of progression over different spaces. You're not just wandering around the exact same boat, if that's what you're expecting. It's like different little locked off areas that you're exploring.
So in terms of actually playing the game, I take it you don't recommend that I play through it all in one sitting. Is it better if I play a bit at a time, or like spread over a week, or do it in one night? How did you play it?
It's a very free-form game for how you want to solve the puzzles. So, I did it occasionally back and forth. I don't think I did it all in one sitting, or my playthrough of it all in one sitting. But it is definitely quite addictive to go to form, but I definitely think you can do it in chunks.
I completely no-lifed it. I got it on my TV on launch day, and me and my partner, we sat down and we got all these notebooks out, and we were like, right, we are doing Obra Dinn, and we spent almost 11 hours just playing it in one go, absolutely no-lifing it. Like, we had snacks, we had like maps drawn out and like character names, and like scenes that we needed to go back to at some point because we knew that something was in there. We didn't know what was in there, but stuff that we needed to go back and check, and we just went for it. And I think that was a really cool experience for me because it turned the game into like an event that we just really wanted to get stuck into. And I think that's a really fun way to do it because it's kind of a game that you can only play once.
Well, I'm gonna go and immerse myself in this game for the next couple of days, weeks. I don't know. I could come back a different person. I could come back an actual private boat detective. But until then. Return of the Obra Dinn opens on a stark horizon with a soundtrack of adventurous strings. You're told that the eponymous ship has returned from its time at sea with the fate of its crew, led by Robert Witterell, being unknown. You are an insurance agent that must discover exactly what happened. You're ferried across lonely waters by a hoarse voice, and it is here that you hear your character's voice for one of the few times in the entire game.
Seems a bit late if you ask.
I didn't.
What's in the box?
I don't know. Hoist it up in a few minutes.
Hey! Ow!
Carefully.
Return of the Obra Dinn is a detective game in which you must uncover the fate of 60 people aboard the ship by harnessing the power of a magical pocket watch that transports you back to the moment of their death. Each scene you travel to is a tableau of what happened in the second of their demise, and it's up to you to scour these scenes and look for clues. Using deductive reasoning and a fair amount of guesswork, it's your job to complete a ledger detailing what happened to everyone on board. Return of the Obra Dinn wants you to think like a detective. The game's opening hours are designed to teach you how to work out the identity of a crewmate and how that information will help you complete the ledger's large drawing of everyone on board. Each fate is made up of several parts. There is the identity of the person who has died, how they died, and who was the culprit. This often leads to situations wherein the method and the killer may be clear, but the actual victim's identity remains a mystery. To stop players from brute forcing their way through the game by randomly entering details and names, Return of the Obra Dinn will let you know when you have enough information to make a deduction by unblurring the face of the victim on the sketch. The game also reveals correct answers in sets of 3s, meaning you will often need 9 pieces of information to be correct in order to receive the dopamine rush of being right. I feel like I'm about a third of the way through the game. I've just worked backwards to chapter 1, and now it seems like I have to take all of these clues and start filling out the rest of the ledger. I've got about 9 of the fates thus far. I'm really enjoying myself with it in terms of I enjoy whodunits, I enjoy puzzle games, and it feels a bit like, funnily enough, the first thing it made me think of was a Sudoku puzzle in terms of just putting random possible entries into points to try and flesh it out a little bit, and then you can work backwards through the process of elimination in order to actually get the result that is required. I'm enjoying the story. I think it's very interesting. I thought initially I'd be overwhelmed by the sheer number of characters on the boat, but I'm starting to recognize faces and put things together, which is incredibly impressive considering how limited the graphical style is. It's obviously, they have intentional details to make you think, oh, that's that guy, such as like haircuts and mustaches and things like that. And I think my favorite sort of resolution thus far was when there's the character that's Danish, and one of the people refers to him as that Dane, and I was like, okay, right, so there's only a certain amount of nationalities. Is there one Danish guy? Turns out there was, and that character that called him the Dane also referred to that Danish guy as killing his brother. So you look in the ledger for 2 people with the same last name, you think, okay, so it has to be one of those, and then later in the game when it reveals how that character died, you can make that deduction. That stuff is extremely fun. The element of the faces becoming unblurred when you have enough to identify them is interesting, because there's a few faces that have become unblurred that I feel like I'm nowhere close to identifying. I'm excited to get back into it. I'm gripped. I feel like I have to play it in long sessions, because if not, I lose those clues that were like ruminating in my head as I go. My only real issue thus far is I don't really understand what triggers going from the past back into the present, because there's been a few times where I've been in those sort of very theatre-esque tableaus of the past where I've wanted to look around a bit more, and then the screen constricts and sends me back into the future. I know you can go back to those anytime you want, but I wish that was a command rather than seemingly random. I don't know if it is in fact random. I might be triggering something, but I can't really seem to tell. But apart from that, I'm really enjoying it. The atmosphere is amazing. The music is just ridiculously good, and it's funny. It's a funny game, despite the grim subject matter. Once you've established how Obra Dinn works, and you've been through each of the game's flashbacks once, it's then your job to retrace your 1-bit steps. Things that seemed innocuous during your first visit become vital to uncovering a clue. In many ways, the mid-game feels like a journey to topple one big domino before watching the rest fall into place. I often found myself desperately seeking out one name that would set off a chain reaction towards verifying several fates. Something else that makes Return of the Obra Dinn incredibly unique is that your own life experience determines how helpful certain clues are. For example, the ship is full of different accents, which to my knowledge, at least the British ones, are incredibly accurate. Accurate enough that I was able to establish several identities. Once I started revisiting flashbacks, I found myself hyperfixating on certain areas, convinced that the hunch I was working with would lead to dozens of identities falling into my lap. For example, there's a memory you can return to in one of the lower decks in which several characters are playing cards. They're speaking Russian, and there's only 3 Russians on board, so you've instantly eliminated several options. I felt like I was mentally flicking down their portraits in a big nautical game of Guess Who. Also in that area are several hammocks, all of which have numbers on them. Where was the last time you saw things numbered? The ledger. As soon as I put this together, my notebook was whipped out and a list of names and numbers began being scribbled down, desperately trying to put it all together. The best and most impressive part is that you could probably solve the game without noticing that, or noticing that the characters that share the same rank on the ship wear the same uniform. There are so many ways to solve this that it genuinely feels personalised to each player. I felt like my general knowledge of roles on a ship meant that I could easily identify the top men without having to resort to the glossary. It's now been 2 days since I started my journey with Return of the Obra Dinn, and I feel like I'm about halfway there, and I also feel like the game has really clicked into something that is making me understand why it's held in such great regard. I have around 30 of the fates resolved at this point, and a lot of them were the key kind of threads that I was pulling at, and it's nice to see them all fixed. The one that I still can't get, this person, I'll put their face up now, as of right now I have no idea who that is. Despite the game indicating that it's an easy resolution to make, I must have just missed it, or via process of elimination it's just not clicked for me yet. But I've had a few names that I was sure it was, and then when fates resolve, he's never part of that list. That element of trial and error also showed to me why the game resolves fates in sets of 3, so that you can't simply give one character every single name and every single, if you know how a character dies, you can't just give them every single name and then have it check off. You have to do that with 2 other fates. I suppose you could trick the game by having 2 other definite fates and then resolving that mystery fate. I was surprised by the point of no return, the point at which the boat comes back and you're summoned to go over to the island when it starts raining, and the game warns you saying you're never coming back, and it makes me wonder, how many of the fates are you supposed to resolve? What is the intended amount? Is it all 60 of them? Because that's what I want to do. I think that'd be the most interesting conclusion. I'm having some frustration with the certain memories that you can only access through memories themselves. It's not entirely clear the chain in which you have to go to get to certain memories. It's obviously shown on the map and you can plot a character's points on the map, but it's a bit obscure. It only happens a few times. I'm thinking specifically with the memories that are tied to the dinghies that are that most of those characters are killed in the water by those mermaid-like creatures. A lot of those you have to go through certain characters to get to their memories. I wish that was a bit more streamlined, but that's my only real frustration. The frustrations that I have are being alleviated by reason and deduction. I only ever get frustrated really when I am not thinking things through clearly enough, but the sense of relief when that well done pops up and that little audio cue happens is unparalleled. It's an incredible feeling. There is a character in the game who is the Doctor, and he is the one who gives you this book, or rather it is his book. There's a note signed from him at the start of the book, and it also tells you that he is in Morocco. So as soon as you find out who the character that the Doctor is, you can say he is alive in Morocco, and because of the circumstances in which he is alive, the other characters that are on said boat, you can sort out a load of other characters that I deduced who the Doctor was without even looking at that part of the book. I just did it via the characters that have illnesses, and that's also how I established the surgeon's mate. It's interesting that there's not one definitive way to establish certain characters. I don't understand how one would go about designing this. It's mind-boggling because you have to almost work in reverse for each separate resolution and make them all intertwine, and in that you've only got say there's 4 or 5 tableaus in the 8 chapters. You only have 4 or 5 of those per chapter to establish how they all perished or where they were on certain parts of the ship and make it solvable for a player. It's incredibly deep. It is terrifyingly well designed as a game. I think that's the thing that impressed me most about it. Making a whodunit is complicated enough. Making a whodunit with around 60 different outcomes is just staggering. My final night playing through Return of the Obra Dinn was one of the most satisfying nights I can remember having with a game. Not only did I finally identify the man in the hat, a special fuck you to Henry Brennan, but I was still finding ways that the game could surprise or mislead me. For example, looking out onto the sea during the Kraken attack and seeing bodies I couldn't zoom in on to identify being thrown into the sea. Hope takes away your most useful tool and makes you not only retrace your steps but follow them through their previous few scenes. However, without a doubt, my favourite solution in the entire game takes place on the Orlop deck. Zungi Sati is a ship steward that can be found a few times during the game. He has a unique face in the sketch, as he's one of the only characters to have a mustache without a beard. And, as is made clear by several other deductions, small details like this are key. While you can establish he's a steward from the clothing, and you can make an educated guess on his nationality due to his complexion relative to others in the role, establishing just how he died is the moment that made me want to put down my controller and applaud. You find him in a small section of the ship between the Orlop deck and the outer wall. There's a trail of blood leading towards him and he's hunched over bleeding out. At the same time, in the Orlop deck, the rest of the crew is fighting a demon that has boarded the ship in an attempt to rescue the treasure deep in the bowels of the Obra Dinn. Your first presumption, based on the way the creatures have killed others, is that he was spiked, a general catch-all term for the projectiles that these monsters fire. That was my presumption too, but as the game progressed and I resolved more and more fates, Zungi's fate would never turn from the handwritten speculation into typewritten fact. As I was nearing the end of my list, most of the biggest foes slain, again fuck you to Henry Brennan and your stupid hat, I couldn't seem to get Zungi. I sat there looking for other signs of damage. Had he been stabbed? Maybe. There was a trail of blood leading to him. Was he ill? Several shipmates had caught something, but it didn't seem that way. And then I saw it. There were a tiny peephole, so far away that I couldn't even focus on who it was, but I could tell what was happening. In the melee of trying to fight this massive bit of seaweed with legs, Charles Minor, the bosun's mate that you can identify via his bald head, much like me, misfired and shot Zungi through the wall. Lucas Pope, you done it again. After completing all the available fates, you send the book back to the Doctor, and then several months later you receive a parcel containing a monkey's paw, presumably the same monkey that the Doctor is seen with throughout the game. Upon receiving the paw, the character uses the pocket watch one last time in order to reboard the Obra Dinn, this time with access to the lazarette, an area in the bottom of the ship that was inaccessible until then. It's here where the game's plot comes to its conclusion, for better or worse. You learn that the Formosan passengers aboard the ship were transporting an artifact, something of such significant power that the mermaids wanted it back. After the ship captures the mermaids and locks them in the lazarette, they summon various creatures of the sea until finally awakening the Kraken. The captain, in a desperate attempt to make it home, bargains with the mermaids to call the Kraken off and direct the Obra Dinn back to England. I didn't find the resolution all that interesting. It almost feels like window dressing to the actual story, which is the interpersonal relationships aboard the ship. The whispers of mutiny and the double crossing throughout the ship was interesting, but to hide this chapter seemed unnecessary. The most interesting revelation is that it confirms that the Doctor understood how the pocket watch worked, purposefully killing his monkey inside the lazarette in order to have a way to get back there. The implications of this for the rest of the game are vast and are something that I wish was explored slightly more. Upon its release, Return of the Obra Dinn was extremely well received. At the time of writing, the PC version has an 89 on Metacritic, boasting such scores as a 9.2 from IGN. While many reviews highlighted the incredible visual style and clever writing, many were enamoured with just how the game encourages you to use your deductive reasoning. You're more coroner than detective, in truth. The coldly analytical process, though fitting given your position, tells you far more about how these victims died than how they lived. Even if you can sympathise with the combination of hubris, poor choices and good old-fashioned bad luck that brought them to their sticky ends.
I mentioned in the Unavowed review that I appreciate a game that makes me feel clever because God knows precious little does since the stroke, and that's exactly what Obra Dinn does, for you see, most people when seconds from death aren't courteous enough to say things like, "Oh no, I, 3rd Officer Eric Braithwaite, am soon to die, but at least I'm in the company of my friends Bob and Hercules, cough cough splatter splatter."
You may only see them in scratchy monochrome stills and hear them in brief snatches of urgent conversation, if at all. But if you're paying attention, then you should feel like you know almost every one of these 60 people intimately by the end of the game.
Obra Dinn is an incredible experience. It's the sort of game that you'll play with a pad full of notes, making timelines and jotting down details, looking for clues and hints until something clicks and you enter in your answer. Over and over again, it offers those sorts of eureka moments that detective games promise, but so often fail to deliver.
Return of the Obra Dinn stands as something wholly unique. An investigative puzzle game with clear goals but completely open-ended paths to completing them. It's a challenging exercise in piecing together a mystery without being spoon-fed what to pay attention to. While there is plenty of effusive praise for the game, a few recurring issues were echoed by critics. While the art style looks incredible, many found issues with it, occasionally obfuscating the solutions to the murders.
Its art style already looked ancient before the game was released. I am legally mandated to mention that Lucas Pope also made Papers, Please, and can use that to point out the similar quality that game has in its art style. I think Papers, Please is more successful with its use, even though Return of the Obra Dinn is a much more complicated game visually. You're studying the shapes of faces much more in Papers, Please, and the art style complements that gameplay, whereas in Return of the Obra Dinn, I felt like it only ever improved the atmosphere and occasionally got in the way of the gameplay.
I certainly noticed this as well, with the specific example of the character being stabbed on the rowboat coming up more than once. However, even with that caveat, it's really difficult to find any negative reviews of the game that seem to be acting in good faith. It's one of the few indie games that has crossed the divide of being the game's journalist darling into penetrating more of the mainstream. Writer and director and the creator of Black Mirror, Charlie Brooker, lists it as one of the best games he's played in years. And the geriatric Scottish streamer Limmy was incredibly positive on the game when he streamed his playthrough.
Oh, look at this. So this jock. This fucking jock's a mutiny. Yeah, fucking head jocks. Oh, I like this.
There are many different ways to pin down the identity of each person, and it's likely that most players get through the roster in dramatically different orders. Dramatically different orders. Dramatically different orders.
Dramatically different orders.
He got him 4th. I sat here night after night desperately clinging onto who this wee prick is. I go to sleep at night and I close my eyes and I see his wee rat face and his stupid fucking beanie, and he got him 4th. After spending so much time with the game and soaking in as many think pieces and reviews as I could, there was only really one person I wanted to hear from. Lucas Pope isn't your typical video game auteur. He began his career making Quake mods before a stint at Naughty Dog making GUI tools for Uncharted 1 and 2. An echo of his time there can actually be seen in the credits, with the special thanks to Bruce Straley, a former Naughty Dog director and one half of the Druckmann and Straley partnership that has seen that studio flourish. After leaving Naughty Dog, Pope rose to prominence with his Passport 'em Up, Papers, Please, a genuinely fresh idea, the DNA of which can be felt in Obra Dinn. Like a great indie band's first album, Papers, Please was all anyone was talking about for years, meaning that his next release was hotly anticipated. Interviews with the creator are fairly rare. He's currently living a quiet life in Japan with his family, working on Mars After Midnight, a new game for the curious little yellow box, The Playdate. However, a few years ago, friend of the channel Danny O'Dwyer sat down with Lucas as part of his No Clip podcast to discuss the game's creation, troubled final weeks, and legacy.
There's no way I can match the art skill of a Naughty Dog or a AAA studio, so I'm going to try to kind of not leapfrog, but I'm just going to go a completely different way and not compete on those same terms at all. So that's part of the challenge of making a game for me, is finding that way to not compete and to make sure that the things that I create are not going to be compared one for one against what a bigger, more resourceful studio can do. So I wouldn't say like working at Naughty Dog taught me that I can just do anything with the art, like the artist can make the most amazing things and the game is going to be awesome for it. It was more about just the style of production that they have there. Taught me a lot about focus and real kind of think about what the final result is going to be. Don't think about the components that make it up as much. I mean, the components are important, but one problem I used to have as an engineer is that I would want the code to be perfect. I wanted the systems that I was designing to be elegant, and if an engineer looked at them, I wanted them to think, yeah, man, that's pretty good code he's got there. But what I learned at Naughty Dog is none of that matters. What matters is what happens when the player puts the controller in their hand. And a lot of times those two things are connected, but a lot of times they're not. And it's a difficult lesson to learn if you're strictly an engineer all the time, to sort of back off on your number one OCD skill.
Right.
And say that actually what's more important is that, even if this is kind of shitty code here, it works pretty much how I can predict how it works, and I know that the end result will sort of be like this, and that feels really good to the player. So that was a good lesson too. Let me sit down and try to make a 1-bit 3D game. And once I started doing that, I had a couple different ideas I could do with it. One of them was set in Egypt. One of them would be on a ship. One of them is somewhere else, a power plant. And just sort of thinking about having to do everything, I thought, well, the easiest thing is going to be a ship because it's a contained space. So I kind of just decided, okay, it's going to be a ship. And I started researching. And at the same time, I was getting my chops down with Maya again. I'd used Maya a long time ago, but I hadn't done a lot of 3D stuff recently. So a lot of learning was happening on the tool side, which meant less focus on what am I actually going to do with this. So by the time I realized that the ship was going to be a huge pain in the ass and a ton of work, it was too late. I was already committed to it. The book seems obvious in retrospect, but I was pulling my hair out for a long time about how to structure and arrange the events on the ship for a long time in a way that the player could reference and understand easily. And actually, if you look in the book, there's a deck map which shows all the flashbacks, the location of the body of each flashback. And there's this, once you finish them all, there's like this really crazy system of arrows that connects them all. And if you look at it, it's just a jumble of spaghetti arrows and X's and shit. That was originally my solution to letting the player understand. There was no book. It was just that map with arrows everywhere on it. So you can see it took me a long time to get from that to a full book with a page for each flashback divided into chapters, with referencing and bookmarks and all that stuff. But once I had the book, I realized how useful it was and how it contextualized almost everything in the game. And the metaphor is so easy to understand that I got a lot of things for free, basically, by doing the book. And even having like a death on each page wasn't obvious from the beginning. Though I tried a lot of things for how to arrange the structure of the book, and sort of ended up with this one. So in my mind, the book was always a supplement to helping you understand the story. It wasn't a way to navigate. I was beyond done with this thing. I was so exhausted from working on this, and I made so many very big design changes near the end that it was basically like, I don't care if this game gets like a 0% because you can't fast travel. Like, I can't deal with the design changes that's going to inject into this game. So, I can justify it now and say that I don't want the player traveling around, but really, like, one of the really important parts of that decision is that it would have changed so many things so late at that point in the game that I just couldn't manage it.
Listening to Lucas Pope talk about Return of the Obra Dinn, it feels like a miracle that it came out the way it did. From his reflections on how much work it took, to his admissions of massive design decisions changing in the final weeks, to even things like how localization, one of the final aspects of a game before it launches, nearly completely derailed the project.
In English we have the verb knifed. You can say, I knifed somebody. And that's like both general and specific. It's specific that you use a knife, but it's general that like I could have cut your throat, I could have stabbed you, I could have done all kinds of things to kill you with a knife. Most of the languages don't have that verb, and to understand that is if you think of the verb to be killed by a sword, for example, in English. We don't have sworded in English, and I really wish we did because it would have made things a lot easier. So other languages also don't have knifed. So when you're sort of designing a grammatical system where you want to work across all these different languages, you need to remember as an English-only speaker basically that you can't say John knifed George. You could say John killed George with a knife, but then you're talking about a different sort of grammatical structure for the sentence. And you can imagine that problem expanded across 7 different languages who all treat sentences differently and also treat gender differently.
The game feels like a labour of love. You really couldn't concentrate enough to make something that's intricate and interwoven without an irrational passion for it. It's fittingly like building a ship in a bottle. Even if you're beyond exhausted and frustrated by the end of the process, if you don't keep working in such fine margins at the end as you did at the start, it'll all collapse. But Return of the Obra Dinn didn't collapse, it made it back to England. Through listening to Lucas talk about the game, I do get the sense that even he is surprised that it landed the way it did. He honestly talks about it sometimes like a project that the frustrations of which overshadow how well it eventually done. I relate immensely to that. I can't count the amount of times I've finished something and then regardless of the quality, I can only think back about the absolute headache it caused. But for Lucas Pope, it was worth it. Return of the Obra Dinn is an extraordinary game. It engages a part of your mind that is so often ignored while playing games, and it executes its ideas with very few consequences. It's a game that you can't really compare to anything else, and I can't remember having an experience with a game that I can compare in terms of how invested I felt, how desperate I was to uncover the truth, and how much it dominated my thinking outside of playing it. I don't think the game is perfect, but as any game, my issues with visual muddiness and occasional controller clunk really pale in comparison to the sheer enjoyment I got out of those 3 days devouring the game, and the subsequent couple of weeks researching the game and listening to Lucas Pope. This is potentially overstepping the mark due to how deeply I've immersed myself in this game and thought about it over the past couple of weeks, but it almost feels vital for someone passionate about the canon of video games to play it. In the same way that one plays Super Mario Bros. And sees how that game echoes throughout the years, this is an extraordinary statement about the medium of games and what can be achieved by someone who not only respects the player's intelligence, but is willing to challenge it. I wonder how this game will be viewed in 5 to 10 years, and what its impact on the games industry will be. These mechanics feel like something that we should have seen a big budget attempt at by now, but as far as I'm aware, no one has tried, perhaps resigned to the idea that they'll never capture the magic. It's almost tragic in a way that despite being one of the best games I've played, possibly ever, I don't think I'll ever play Return of the Obra Dinn again. Sure, I may watch someone else play it over their shoulder, but it really is an experience that you can only have once. I can't think of another piece of media I've loved this much yet have no desire to ever experience again. Well, that's not strictly true. If you could bottle how good this journey has been, I'd shoot it intravenously, but you can't. You can only step aboard the good ship Obra Dinn for the first time once. It's astonishingly clever, jaw-dropping in its creativity, and one of the most immersive games I've ever played. I completely get it now. I will never forget this game. It's a masterpiece.